Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Emperor the Living Legend, and this is Trains of the Day. In this series, I will talk about many examples of steam locomotives from their mainline, their history behind them, and excursions, service, and during also their career. I'll also talk about extinct and non-survived members of locomotives. This series was inspired by Andrew Alabama's own series, Dead on Arrival, where he talks about bad or unsuccessful locomotives. The purpose of these videos is to educate and not to insult viewers. Before we talk about A44's history, let's talk about the born of the FEF class, or the A100s. Beginning in the late 1930s, Union Pacific saw a problem. With the demands rising and long and heavy it goes, the current 482s began to struggle to pull passenger and freight trains for the same reason. So they went to their favorite locomotive builder, the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, to create a design to pull 20 heavyweight passenger car speeds up to 90 miles per hour. After going back and forth with UP and FEF, with UP what design they want, eventually decided to purchase the first FEFs. 20 FEF-1 were built by ALCO at their works in Schenectady, New York, from 800 to 819. Not the L1 from Cottonville, the FEF-1 from the Union Pacific. The design was so successful that in 1942, that's right, during World War II, the UP purchased 15 FEF-2, 820 to 834. They look a bit different design. In 1944, purchased the last FEFs, the FEF-3, which is also, so we're gonna talk about the 10 FEF-3 from 835 to and of course 844. Up to 1945, 45 of those engines will be built and produced by ALCO. All FEFs in the UP were assigned to pull passenger trains, and like the Overland Limited, Los Angeles Limited, City of San Francisco, the Challenger, you may know. They can also pull breakdown trains, and later they will be assigned to freight trains as the FEFs, as diesels at the time began to take over. However, by the time when UP dieselized, all FEFs have been retired by 1961, putting them into storage. There are 3 locomotives, or should I say 4. A14 FEF-1 is on display at Nebraska / Concord Bluffs, Iowa. FEF-2 833 was on display in Salt Lake, Utah, before it was moved to the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden with GTEL Gen 3 number 23 and Centennial 6912. Now, we're going to A44's history. Union Pacific FEF-3 number 844 was the last steam locomotive to be built by the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, in December of 1944. During her revenue service, she pulled passenger trains up to 20 passenger cars up to 90 miles per hour, like the Challenger and the Overland Limited, for example. She burned coal, but just a year in service, all FEFs, including A44, were converted from burning coal to oil. In 1957, she was assigned to pull freight trains as diesels in the UP started to take over passenger trains. She remained in service up to 1959, when A44 was put into storage at the UP's Cheyenne Roundhouse in Wyoming. But instead of scrapping her, UP opened their steam program for A44 to pull excursions, and A38 will be the spare donor for. And when I mean spare donor, I mean literally spare parts. During her excursion career, she pulled numerous excursions, but in 1962, she was renumbered to 8444 after a GP30 also numbered 844 around that time, which made confusion. In 1969, she pulled the Golden Spike Centennial Limited from Salt Lake, Utah to Ogden, Utah, taking the excursion from Rollin's restored locomotive, and that was the Nickel Plate Road S3 number 759 to celebrate the 100th anniversary driving of the Golden Spike, completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The locomotive A44 returned the Golden Spike Limited 759. After that, she returned to excursion service. In 1974, she was participating in Expo 74 in Spokane, Washington. Then, a year later, met up with Southern Pacific GS4 4449. Around that time, 4449 was restored as American Freedom Train, still with the number plate. In 1989, A44, I'm going to say it, went back, joined with Southern Pacific GS4 4449, and again to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal, doing side-by-side photo. A few years later, they'll end by running into the Oklahoma Pass with Southern Pacific and Santa Fe routes, which UP adopted. That same year, A44 was renumbered back to its original plate, from 8444 to 844, after the last GP30 were retired, and the last engine, GP30 number 844, not FEF-3 number 844, was survived and is still operation. And of course, in 1990, the engine A44 pulled the Eisenhower Centennial Special train from Kansas City Union Station to Bellini, Kansas for the World War II veterans to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The name was given to the Illinois Grassley A4 number 4496, now as British Railways 60,008. In 1997, she went to the NRHS convention in St. Louis, Missouri. Meeting Frisco T54 number 1522, the sole survivor Norfolk and Western Class A number 1218, and Cotton Belts L1 number 819. In 1999, she was put on display at the California State Railroad Museum in Rail Fair 99, but after a major fluke failure, the engine was taken out of service, and by 2004, she returned to service. In 2007, she went with 4449 doubleheader excursion to the Pacific Northwest from Tacoma to Everett, Washington on the BNSF railway trackage. 5 years later, she pulled the 150 event hosted by the California State Railroad Museum, but stopped in Walsenburg, Colorado for a night photo session, parked next to the Lake Superior Ischenberg, now 280 number 18, who operated up to the who 18 operated at the Rio Grande Scenic Railroad until its closure. However, while pulling the excursion in Martinez subdivision, E44 stopped because her tender derailed. Eventually, the tender was put back on track and to continue her excursion service. In 2013, her Mars light was removed. The reason why is that the Mars light was mounted at the bolts that was deteriorated. By 2014, A44 was taken out of service for boiler work and eventually getting the 15-year overhaul. By 2016, she returned to service, pulling the Cheyenne Frontiers Days excursion after a brake test run. A year later, she pulled the Oregon Shoreline excursion to celebrate the 92nd anniversary of the Boys UP Depot. The trip was cut, however, the trip was cut after a heavy snow at Wet Springs, and the result, the engine crossed to the Mallet River because of a bridge was washed out. In 2019, she went for a doubleheader with the restored Big Boy 4014 to pull the excursion to UP's Ogden Station for the city's Heritage Festival. Nowadays, A44 sits at her home in Cheyenne, Wyoming. As of now, there are no plans for her future excursions. Although she is not current operation condition, she is still an active member of Union Pacific from 1960. One day, she will appear for excursion service. Thanks for watching. If you're interested of trains or elevators, consider subscribing and turn on all notification bell. And again, thanks for watching and happy summer holidays. I'll go back by September.